Thank you, Ed. There we go. My name is Wendell Potter, and for 20 years, I was a senior executive at health insurance companies. And I saw how they confuse their customers and dump the sick, all so they can satisfy their Wall Street investors. Those are the words that I used to introduce myself before Congress in June of 2009. June 24th, 2009 to be specific, and I was testifying before the Senate Commerce Committee. And this was during the early months of the debate in Washington on what would become the Affordable Care Act. I knew as soon as I finished my testimony that day that my life would change. I knew that I would be considered by my former colleagues in the health insurance industry and by the industry as the health insurance industry's public enemy number one. Because I was there to kind of pull the curtains back to help people understand, help lawmakers in particular understand how the health insurance industry really operated, to give them an understanding that they didn't get from the lobbyists for the industry. I also knew that they would probably try to discredit me if they could, to destroy me, to shut me up, because I knew that because I had been involved in efforts in the past. In fact, one in particular just 2 years earlier, to discredit and try to shut up a critic of the industry, a filmmaker who I'll tell you about in just a few minutes. Before I get to that, I want to tell you a little bit more about me and how I got to be an industry executive. I started my career in healthcare with a nonprofit organization in Tennessee called the East Tennessee Baptist Health System. I was hired largely to promote that health system's new HMO. It was the beginning of the managed care era. And I was a strong advocate and believer in the concept of managed care. And also the concept of the free market, that the free market worked in healthcare just as it would in any other sector of the economy. I came to understand otherwise, and I'll explain that in just a few minutes. I went from Baptist to Humana. I was recruited to go to Humana, which at the time was known largely as a hospital company. While I was there, the company decided to sell off all of its hospitals to focus on its managed care business. It was determined by the executives and by investors that that was a much more profitable line of business than operating hospitals. So I rose up through the ranks, and I was reporting to the president when I was recruited to Cigna. And I also rose up through the ranks there, and by the time I left Cigna in 2008, I was head of corporate communications. I was the chief spokesman for the company. I handled financial communications for the company to the media, so I had to know how my company operated, how the industry operated, how we did business. I was on the phone on a regular basis with reporters from the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. And I also had an orientation to Washington. In addition to doing that, was working with colleagues of mine, peers of mine at other companies, and with our trade association to develop public relations plans, PR strategies, public affairs strategies to control the debate on healthcare reform. We had in the past, I'd done this in the past, going back to the Clinton era. That was I joined Cigna just as the Clinton plan was taking shape. You may remember 1993, and part of the job that I did was to develop a public relations campaign to make people believe that the Clinton plan was not good for them. It was based on what we in the industry have referred to as FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And that's at the heart of a lot of the campaigns that I have been a part of over many years. We wanted people to fear the Clinton plan, to be uncertain about how they would be affected by it, and to doubt that those who were advocating for it were really looking out after their best interest. But I was okay with that. I felt that my industry and my companies in particular were good companies, and that the health insurance industry played an essential role in the American healthcare system. I came to see it differently over the years. But one of the things that I did at Cigna leading up to what became the debate on the Affordable Care Act. While I was still in the industry, we felt pretty certain that a Democrat was more than likely going to win the White House in 2008. And we felt fairly certain that the Congress would more than likely be controlled by Democrats. And if so, there undoubtedly would be another push for health care reform. So I was involved in efforts to develop the strategy to try to keep that from happening, to try to keep any legislation from being passed, if at all possible, and if not, to shape that legislation to suit my company and my industry, and in particular to suit shareholders. I worked for two of the largest investor-owned health insurance companies in the country during my career. I was also involved in an effort to discredit a certain filmmaker who, let's see if I can get this to go here. Seems not, there we go. You remember this guy, or probably know who this guy is. Just before that healthcare reform debate was really getting traction, in 2007, this guy had been working for a couple of years on his latest movie. And we knew from what he had said that it was going to be focusing on healthcare. We didn't know exactly what. Rumors were circulating that it was going to be the pharmaceutical industry, and I was pretty delighted about that. But I couldn't take any chances. I assumed that he might come calling at Cigna, and so I media trained my CEO and all of our executives just in the event that Michael Moore would do one of his famous ambush interviews. But we still didn't know what the movie was about. We didn't have any ambush interviews, so I was kind of believing that it indeed might be about the pharmaceutical industry. The movie premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in May of 2007. We still didn't know what it was about. So my industry, through our trade association, America's Health Insurance Plans, bought a ticket for one of the trade association's employees to fly from Washington to the south of France to get and got a ticket for him to be able to see the movie at its first screening. We wanted to know what it was about, obviously, and if we were a part of it. And his job was to call back to the States. I was one of about 20 people waiting to hear the news after that screening. And of course, our worst fears were realized. It was indeed about the health insurance business. It was not about the rising number of people who did not have insurance, which, as I'll note in a few minutes, played a big role in the rising number of people without insurance. It was about people who had insurance but couldn't get the care that they needed for one reason or another. They were denied care by someone at any large number of health insurance companies that he portrayed in his film. I knew that Cigna was mentioned, but I didn't know exactly how much. So the first screening was being held in Sacramento. I bought my own ticket and flew from Philadelphia to Sacramento to see the movie the very first time it was shown in this country. And I was sitting in the back of the theater taking notes so that I would be equipped to handle calls from the media that I knew would be coming when reporters started seeing this movie. And I realized as I was watching the movie that I was going to have a pretty hard time doing that, because it was very clear to me that it was a very accurate portrayal of the health insurance business, and that the stories, the anecdotes that he told in that movie were accurate, and certainly the ones that involved Cigna. And I think also his portrayal of healthcare systems abroad and how our system compared to those. And I still, though I was a part of an industry effort to discredit him, it was very important for us to try to get Americans to believe that Michael Moore was out of step with American values. We wanted to make sure that people felt that this was not an accurate portrayal, that he was advocating for a government takeover of healthcare. I'm sure you've heard that term, a term that we use time and time again and got our allies in Congress to use repeatedly to scare people away from reform. And we did a pretty good job. One of the things that we did was create a front group called Healthcare America that we tried to get people to believe was a grassroots organization. It was nothing of the kind. It was funded entirely by the insurance industry with a little money from the pharmaceutical industry, operated by a big PR firm in Washington, churned out press releases and talking points to give, in particular to Democrats. And our lobbyists were fanning out across Capitol Hill, telling Democrats who we knew and would give campaign contributions to, warning them essentially, don't get anywhere close to this movie. Don't even think about endorsing this movie or even showing up at a showing of it, because if you do, you'll not see any more campaign contributions from the insurance industry. And that we instead will probably give money to your opponent the next time you're up for re-election. It was intimidation, and it worked. I don't recall a member of Congress going to any of those screenings. So to a large extent, we succeeded. I probably would still be in the industry, though. Might have stayed on for another 10 years waiting for my retirement, had it not been for a couple of other things that occurred very soon after that. The very next month, I decided to go back home to Tennessee to visit my family. I picked up my newspaper while I was there, the hometown newspaper that I'd actually worked for when I was a kid, as a very young reporter. My first reporting job, I was a newspaper reporter for several years. I had a very successful journalism career as well, too. I covered healthcare. I covered politics in Nashville for a few years, and then I got a chance to go to Washington to cover Congress and the White House for Scripps Howard newspapers. And then I got into PR work, and without ever believing that I would wind up in the insurance industry, I did, and I had one of the best jobs in the business, and certainly one of the best paying jobs in corporate PR. When I was in Tennessee, and that paper that I picked up had a story about something called a healthcare expedition that was being held a few miles from where I grew up in Kingsport, Tennessee, actually across the state line. Kingsport is in the upper east part of the state, very close to the Virginia line. And it was about something called an expedition that was being held at the Wise County, Virginia Fairgrounds. And Wise County is in the middle of the mountains in southwest Virginia, the coal mining Appalachian section of the state. I was intrigued by what the story was about. It said that people were expected to drive from hundreds of miles around to get to this little tiny town in the middle of the mountains, very inaccessible, to get care that was being provided free by doctors and nurses and dentists and other caregivers over the course of 3 days in late July. I, at the time, was writing this white paper for the industry to try to diminish, to get people to believe that we really didn't need healthcare reform all that much anyway. Especially that to try to get people to believe that the problem of the uninsured was no big deal. The purpose of this white paper was to get people to believe that the people who were uninsured were that way by choice. They were just shirking their individual responsibility. I don't know what it was exactly. I still don't know what drew me to that, except I've often said it was curiosity. I borrowed my dad's Oldsmobile, 92 Oldsmobile, and drove up there. And what I saw when I got there was something I never would have imagined seeing in this country. And I'll show you what I saw. Which way? Oh, okay. Where is it? Back there? There we go. This is what I saw when I walked inside the Wise County, Virginia Fairground site. People were lined up by the hundreds, waiting to get care. They were in lines that stretched out of view, and as you can see, it was raining that day, and a lot of those folks were soaking wet. They were not about to give up their place in line. Some of them had waited in the cars. They'd gone and had parked in the parking lot, slept in the cars for 2 or 3 nights. And I noticed that a lot of those lines, as you'll see in the right-hand corner here, they were leading to barns and animal stalls on the fairground site. I could not believe that I was still in the United States. It was almost like something had happened. I had somehow magically left this country and walked into some foreign country, some undeveloped country, some war-torn country or a refugee camp. But I was in the U.S., and I realized immediately that I was partly responsible for that scene, that the work that I was doing was to mislead people, to perpetuate a system that was very dysfunctional, very unfair, making it necessary for people to get care that way. And I realized that had I not been lucky, had my parents not saved money so I could go to college and get a good job, I could have been one of those folks. And very likely there were people that I grew up with who were in those lines. And I made a commitment that day to find some other way to earn a living. But still, it was a difficult decision, and I might not have made that final decision had it not been something that happened to me a few months after that. I'll come to that in just a minute. But I want to tell you, I'll circle back to my testimony before Congress. And after my decision to leave the industry, I went to Washington a lot. I decided that after this crisis of conscience that I had and my quitting my job, that I might be able to help advocates for reform figure out, to know what to anticipate that the insurance industry and other special interests would be doing to try to kill reform, and also to help them understand what I knew about the health insurance industry that the industry tried to obscure. But soon they said if I wanted to make a difference, I needed to go public with what I knew, with my story. And so that's why I ultimately agreed to testify before Congress. After my first testimony, was asked to testify before several other congressional committees. And I'm told that some of the things that I testified about, some of the things that I pointed out to these lawmakers that they just simply didn't know anything about, influenced the way the bill was written. And I think the ultimate bill did a lot of good. It did bring a lot of people into coverage, and it made some of the practices of the industry unlawful, such as requiring, in many cases, insurance companies would blackball people who applied for coverage, certainly in the individual market. If you had been sick in the past, if you had a pre-existing condition, you were often out of luck. Insurance companies at that time, regardless of their tax status, nonprofits and for-profits alike, were declining 1/3 of all applicants because of a pre-existing condition. And if they were willing to sell coverage to people with a pre-existing condition, often it was at a price they just simply couldn't afford. That was the real reason that we had such a rising number of people without insurance. I'm going to show you a few slides to just show you what was happening before the Affordable Care Act was passed and what's been happening since then, to give you some understanding of why we need to go beyond where we are, why the Affordable Care Act was what I had called at the time the end of the beginning of reform, not where we need to wind up, but a starting point, because we absolutely have a system that we cannot sustain, and I think you'll see in just a minute what I'm talking about. This is a slide that shows you what's been happening to health insurance premiums over the last several years. This is the average cost of a family premium that people get through their workplace, and how it has just gone off the charts over the last several years. And now it's $20,000. That does not include out-of-pocket expenses. That is just premiums. And now employers pay a significant percentage of that, but workers are paying an increasing percentage of the premiums that you get for coverage of the workplace. And this shows you what has been happening to deductibles. One of the reasons I decided to leave my job was because I was expected to be a cheerleader for these high deductible plans, to make people believe that these were necessary. This was the way that we had to go as a country. That people didn't have enough skin in the game, as my CEO and others would say, that people needed to pay more for care before their coverage kicked in. And so this was the scheme, and it's worked beautifully for the industry. It is one reason why the profits for these companies that I work for have just been skyrocketing as well over the past several years. To the point that more than a quarter of Americans who get coverage to their workplace are underinsured because of these high deductibles. And this just shows you what has been happening as those deductibles have gone up. The Commonwealth Fund keeps track of the number of people who are in the ranks of what's referred to as the underinsured. And these are people who have insurance, but their plans have such high deductibles that they really can't use their coverage. A lot of those folks at Wise County, by the way, were insured. All those folks were working people. There were very few people who were unemployed, to tell you the truth. A lot of them worked for companies that didn't offer insurance, but a lot of them did have coverage, but they just didn't have the money to cover the deductibles before their insurance kicked in. And as that's been going on, paychecks have been flat in this country. And a large reason for that is because a lot of the money that employers might otherwise have given to their workers in raises has gone to insurance companies or to cover the cost of these rising premiums. And the cost of benefits has been going up much faster than wages in this country. And while this has been going on, it's not just average folks who've been affected. Increasingly, employers are not able to offer coverage anymore. We have an employer-based system. It's just not working for us as much as it used to. As you'll see here, we're getting close to the point that more than half of employers are getting out of offering benefits. While this has been going on, we have been spending far, far more on a per capita basis than any other country on the planet, including all the countries in the developed world. We spend twice as much as the average of other developed countries on a per capita basis, and so much more in the aggregate. We spend $3.5 trillion a year on healthcare in this country, and we get so little to show for it. And this shows you just the growth of that spending on a per capita basis over the past several years. And what's been happening as a percentage of the gross domestic product in this country just keeps going up. You know, the trend for all these slides, you know, it keeps going up to the upper right here. And there is nothing that is happening in our current system that is changing that trajectory. And this shows you how out of step we are with the rest of the developed world in terms of how much we're spending as a percentage of GDP. Some people say, well, so what? So what? That's our choice. We're only talking obviously about 100% total. And so the more we spend on healthcare, the less is being spent on things like education and infrastructure and other things that we need. It's going into the pockets largely of insurance company executives and shareholders. Despite all this, another thing the Commonwealth Fund does is keep track. They monitor, they do reports on the performance of healthcare systems around the world. They look at 11 developed countries, including the U.S., and before and after the Affordable Care Act, we come in absolutely dead last in terms of health system performance. Anybody know what this car is? Studebaker. It was a very popular car for many years. The Studebaker company goes back to about 1860 or so. It was in business for over 100 years. It finally went out of business in 1960. I think it was 1968. Originally, it was in business making carriages for horses to carry around, but they got into the automobile business. It became a very successful brand until it wasn't popular anymore, and the whole company went out of business in 1968. It's hard to find this car in the country unless you go to an antique car show, but you will find them on the streets of Havana. As you know, you probably have seen, maybe heard of, maybe even seen that they have a lot of American cars that are very old. They keep tinkering with them to keep them running because they don't have many alternatives down there in terms of the transportation. That's sort of like our healthcare system. The reason I put this here is because of the analogy here. We have a healthcare system that's largely built in the Studebaker chassis. And it is just not working for us anymore. We keep tinkering with it. The Affordable Care Act was tinkering. It was keeping the chassis in place when we need transformative change. And that's why I advocate for moving far beyond the Affordable Care Act. An economist I have a great deal of respect for, who passed away not long ago, called the Affordable Care Act an ugly Band-Aid on an ugly system. And it is an ugly system, and one that is extraordinarily unfair and inequitable and expensive, and one that we just simply can't keep putting up with. If you look at that, like I said, there's nothing that is going to change the trajectory of those graphs unless we do something, and do something pretty darn soon. More and more of us are going to wind up in the ranks of the uninsured. The Affordable Care Act brought many of us into coverage, but we now have 30 million who are in the ranks of the uninsured in this country. And more and more and more every year are in the ranks of the uninsured. They're paying good money every month for premiums, but getting less and less value for it. And more people are just saying we can't do this. Another thing that's been happening is that people who have coverage offered to them in the workplace are taking a pass on it because they can't afford the premiums or their contribution, and they see that all these high deductibles is just not good value, so they're willing to take their chances and stay uninsured. I said earlier that there were three things that happened to me in 2007 that resulted in my my decision to leave my job. That's Natalie Sarkeesian, when Natalie was 17 years old in Los Angeles, where she lived. Natalie needed a liver transplant, and her surgeons said that they felt certain that she would come through the transplant and have several years ahead of her, maybe a full lifetime ahead of her if she had that transplant. All bets were off if she didn't. She was in a Cigna policy. She had a Cigna policy and through her father. And it turned out, though, that there was a perfect match. A liver was waiting for her. The surgery was scheduled in December of 2007. The family came to the hospital expecting to wait for her to come out of surgery. But instead, when they got there, they were taken aside by one of her doctors who told them that, "I'm sorry, we can't go forward with the surgery because we've not gotten clearance from Cigna." Her parents told me later, they asked, "Well, what does Cigna have to do with this? We know we have transplants are covered in our policy." And he said, "We're sorry, but Cigna has said no." It turned out that a medical director in Pittsburgh, 2,500 miles away, had looked at some papers that had been faxed to him or emailed to him, and he felt, in his opinion, without seeing Natalie, without examining her, that in his opinion it was not medically appropriate. So he denied it. The family appealed to no avail. So they decided to go public with this story. They started calling reporters in LA. That's how I found out about it, actually, from a call from a Los Angeles TV station. And then I started getting calls from reporters all across LA and throughout California. This family was tenacious. They were determined to try to shame Cigna, to try to bring pressure on the company to change that decision, that denial. I was on the front lines of this because I was getting these calls from reporters. And I had to go into the CEO's office to tell him what was going on, especially when I found out from a call from CNN that they were going to be covering a protest in front of Cigna's offices in Glendale, California. I had a TV in my office, so I had it tuned in to CNN. When I told the CEO this, he made a call or two very quickly. There was a very quick meeting in his office, and the decision was made in a matter of minutes to reverse that denial. And I had the responsibility of figuring out how to get the word to the Sarkeesian family. I did. And I was watching TV when I saw someone whisper into Mrs. Sarkeesian's ear that Cigna had changed its mind, was going to make an exception and cover the transplant. The problem was that in the space of time that the transplant was scheduled, the liver, it wasn't available. It had to be given to someone else. She couldn't, it was no longer available, and she got sicker during this space of time. Her other organs began to shut down. And 5 hours after her family got that good news, Natalie passed away. I did not have it in me to handle, we call these high-profile stories. We call these horror stories, and they were horrible stories. I was a parent. I could just imagine what the family was going through, and I just could not do this again. So a few days later, I turned in my notice. And I've been an advocate for change. I've been someone who continues to try to help people understand what our system is really like and how unfair it is, how inequitable it is, how unbelievably expensive it is, and how we simply cannot keep going forward. Now people say, well, that happened 11 years ago. So surely things have happened. Maybe the Affordable Care Act made that a thing of the past. It did not. The circumstances behind this absolutely was not stopped by the Affordable Care Act. There's a woman in Michigan who a few days ago, this fall, was needing a liver transplant. And one was scheduled, or she was looking to be scheduled for a heart transplant, in Michigan at the Spectrum Health System in Grand Rapids. But 2 days before Thanksgiving, just 2 days before this past Thanksgiving, she got this letter from that clinic, that transplant center, saying that a committee there had decided that she was not eligible for a transplant, and the reason, there was no clinical reason given. The reason given was that she didn't have enough money. She was not rich enough to get that transplant. And they recommended, read that sentence, they recommended that she start a fundraising campaign. So she did. She started a GoFundMe campaign. And folks, people are doing that every single day in this country. They're going to GoFundMe, even if they have insurance, to get the care that they need. We have the most the worst system of rationing care in the world, in my opinion. It is rationed on the basis of ability to pay, and it's getting worse every day. So I encourage you folks to become, if you're not already, advocates for truly transformative change in our healthcare system. I think we absolutely must move to a Medicare for all type system. We must move away from this multi-payer system that is so incredibly inefficient and unfair, and to a system that where everybody is in and nobody's out. Imagine a system in which there is no corporate bureaucrat between a patient and his or her doctor, calling the shots, making the decisions, second-guessing a doctor. Imagine a system in which no one has to go start a fundraising campaign or is forced into bankruptcy, even with insurance, because of care that they need. Imagine that your children are not going to be faced with the same thing that some of these people are. And imagine a system in which we are not just a layoff away from being in the ranks not only of the unemployed, but the uninsured. So folks, I'm going to end on that. I have one more slide. As I was trying to make a decision about whether or not to quit my job and testify before Congress, I was trying to get some inspiration from others who had made life-changing decisions or tried to muster the courage to do something, and I read Profiles in Courage. I found that an old copy of that, and I read the preface that was written by Robert Kennedy. He said his late brother's favorite quote was one that's been attributed to Dante, that the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who in times of moral crisis maintain their neutrality. Folks, we are in a time of crisis, more than we ever have been with our healthcare system. It's getting worse. We can't let much more time go by before we actually start doing something that truly transforms our healthcare system. Thank you very much.